We are honored. We are honored to have you today. We know your caliber, and we are excited to know a lot about your research you have been doing. And I think that this will be some kind of information, not only for knowledge, but sharing between people to understand, this big specter of genocide, humanism, and justice. Because unfortunately, we witness justices today in the 21st century as well. We'll try to connect somehow, genocide, which happened at the beginning of the 20th century, with justice and what is going on right now in the world. It's not only about Armenian genocide, Armenia, but what's going on right now. It's very important too. So if we try to connect somehow, try to find links, it would be very interesting. As I said at the beginning, our keynote speaker today is Dr. George Andreopoulos. We are honored to have you today. Thank you very much for your wish to be with us and to be the co-sponsor of the program, by the way, of this event that we are holding right now. Thank you. The floor is yours. As in the program is noted, we have 15 minutes for your presentation. Then the floor will be open for question and answer session. And then at the end, we will conclude somehow. If there are any questions, we will start our discussion at the end as well. But you have 5 minutes after each speaker. We have 5 minutes for questions and answers. Thank you very much. The floor is yours. We are honored to listen to Dr. Andreopoulos.
Hello, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank Ani and Gohar for their very kind invitation for me to address this important event, as well as to thank the fellow panelists who are participating in this conversation. I'll try to set the Armenian genocide in a broader context. And I will be addressing the quest for justice and what are the lessons from genocidal politics. And by the term genocidal politics, I refer to the deliberate and systematic destruction, of course, of a particular group based on their nationality, ethnicity, racial origin, or religious affiliation, or any other distinct characteristic. As those of you who are familiar with the Genocide Convention know, it has been criticized for having a very restrictive list of protected groups. Now, if somebody looks among different genocides and at the risk of some of their generalizations, they see certain patterns, which of course were very strongly exhibited also in the Armenian genocide. Of course, a pattern of purposeful conduct on the part of their perpetrator, which is guided by some kind of an ideological belief. In the case of Armenian genocide, the ideology of pan-Turkism was critical in this context, as well as a justificatory discourse. And by justificatory discourse, I mean the discourse that is being used by the perpetrator to justify their actions, which of course have nothing to do with genocide. They are denying that they are engaging in genocide. In this context, the justificatory discourse was that those who were killed or in some way mistreated were the victims either of communal violence or were casualties of war. And we see this pattern, of course, repeated in other killings. For example, in the case of the Kurds who were gassed in 1988 in Halabja by the Saddam Hussein regime, the ideological belief there was Arab nationalism. That was the ideological vehicle of the perpetrator. And the justificatory discourse was the need for modernization combined with the need to enhance national security, because the Kurds were suspect as supporting Iran during the Iran-Iraq conflict. A couple of other things that emerged in the Armenian genocide that have haunted other mass killings, very important issues, and although we discuss a lot about them, I'm not sure how much progress we have made. The importance of prevention. an early warning system, because the Armenian genocide serves as a reminder of the fact that, a very strong reminder that these kind of developments do not happen overnight, but they are preceded by a series of discriminatory policies, of dehumanization of your opponent, and the erosion of their rights. And it is important to recognize this early warning side, but the idea is the importance of this is to try to do something about it, and that's when the problems begin. And then the other issue, of course, the international responsibility. Foreign powers knew what was happening. There was a communique that was shared by Western powers to the Supreme Court, in fact, saying that crimes against humanity were being committed. What was their follow-up in the end? Nothing. After the end of the Second War, some low-level trials took place, and others were not, the key players were not persecuted. The message that was delivered was the message of impunity. Now, comes the Second World War, and the idea is supposed to change. That Nuremberg sends the message that never again. And that implies a geopolitical promise to impose criminal accountability. Yet that legacy also emerged tainted after the Second World War for at least a couple of reasons. First of all, because genocide, as you know, comes out of the persecution type of crimes against humanity. Although in the Charter of the Tribunal, crimes against humanity were supposed to be persecuted whether committed before or during the war. In the tribunal, the decision of the tribunal is that although atrocities were committed before the war, they are only going to persecute for crimes that are connected with the other crimes in the tribunal. Therefore, crimes against humanity was linked to aggression, the so-called war nexus requirement. What was the message that this was delivering to the international community? Yes, we are going to move forward towards accountability, but with a caveat. If you cross international borders, you may be held internationally criminally accountable. If you don't cross international borders when you commit that, that's a very different story. Now, Genocide Convention was supposed to break that war nexus requirement, because the very first article of the Genocide Convention says genocide, whether committed in time of war or in time of peace, is an international crime that is supposed to be persecuted. However, the Genocide Convention itself had certain, if I may call, radioactive elements. Two of these radioactive elements were the issue of enforcement, first of all. How could you enforce it? Two ways. Either prosecutions in the country where the genocide took place, which was kind of absurd, because the only way you could prosecute is if the regime was overthrown and the successor regime was supposed to put the perpetrators to some kind of a judicial proceeding, or through an international penal court, for which we had to wait until 2002 to come into existence. So therefore, although the Genocide Convention did break the war nexus requirement, the Genocide Convention was virtually unenforceable for many years until we come to the end of the Cold War. Now, but this was not the only problem there. And this is something else that I want to highlight that is not much discussed. Genocidal killings were taking place also on the aftermath of the Second World War. Just think of Equatorial Guinea under Macias. Just think of what happened to Igbos in Nigeria. Just think of what happened to Cambodia under Pol Pot. But they did not register in the radar screen, the accountability screen, not because the Convention of Genocide was unenforceable, but why? Because the understanding of world order was emphasizing bipolar stability over any quest for justice. In fact, one of the most fascinating pieces I ever read about what happened during this period is a piece in which it described the period between the end of the Second World War and the end of the Cold War as a period of long peace. Meaning what? We did not have any major confrontation between the superpower. Therefore, we don't have any major conflagration. This term obviously was shaped by prioritizing, by privileging notions like containment, deterrence, balance of power. Just these issues were sidelined. The pursuit of justice for the perpetrators of genocide took basically a back seat because a lot of the things that were happening in the global south did not figure in the radar screen of the big powers. We had at the international level, at the top level, a period supposedly of peace, while below that layer of long peace, you had series of ethnocidal conflicts in different parts of the world that the international community did not do anything serious about. It was deterrence, it was balance of power, it was bipolar stability over the quest for justice and accountability. Now, this was supposed to change after the end of the Cold War. I'm sure you'll all remember the great lesson, the great pronouncements about the end of the Cold War will bring a sense of reactivation, collective security, mobilize the United Nations to work as it has never before. That pronouncement by the then Secretary General of the United Nations that we're entering a different period in which human well-being should take precedent over borders and so on and so forth. And when we started seeing forms of genocidal killings, the response of the international community was to create a series of accountability mechanisms. That was welcome as a development that added a new dimension. That is, we are thinking about a world order while the notions of still stability, deterrence are important because you don't want any major conflagration between the powers. We are going to try to take seriously serious violation of human rights and humanitarian law that rise to the level of genocide or crimes against humanity and try to do something about it. The other side of the coin, however, is that some of these mechanisms, although they were created and they were important, and they added new players in the international arena, and some of them had consequences beyond those whose creator intended, were also viewed as an excuse for not doing something more serious to stop these killings. For example, that was the criticism that was raised about the ICTY. You are going to prosecute certain people, but why? You are doing that because we don't want to put boots on the ground to stop the killing. And of course, that criticism was reinforced with the Rwandan genocide, which what we had was a situation in which the United States was refraining from using the term genocide for a long period of time while the killing was taking place, until there was this infamous press conference in the State Department in June 1994, when one journalist asked actually the State Department spokesperson, how many genocide acts do you need in order to have a genocide? Okay, so what we had was, on the one hand, we had this proliferation of accountability mechanism. On the other hand, we did continue to see signs of selective intervention and sometimes outright indifference. Now, does this mean that these mechanisms and processes do not matter? No, that is not true, and it will be unfair, because we've had these tribunals, whether we're talking about the ad hoc tribunals for the former Yugoslavia or Rwanda, whether we're talking about the hybrid tribunals in Sierra Leone, in East Timor, in Kosovo, and so on and so forth, did proceed with the prosecution of certain players and did help to refine the elements of crimes and the importance of these things. At the same time, however, we did continue to see genocidal killings while these mechanisms were operating. Witness, for example, the situation in Darfur, or more recently, what is happening with the Uyghurs in China, which some, of course, organizations have characterized as crimes against humanity, others have characterized as genocide, or what is happening with the situation with their Rohingyas in Myanmar, for which, of course, there is a pending case before the International Court of Justice. So if you look at it, and we don't have time to elaborate in great detail, what is the meaning of these things? Because we have two interesting trajectories. On the one hand, we do have proliferation of accountability mechanisms that is indicating that the quest of justice is on the international agenda. It has entered the table of high politics. It is being discussed, and sometimes it can affect outcomes. But on the other hand, you see in certain major killings indifference. You have to see in certain major killings reluctance to engage in any serious way, and ignoring them, basically. So what is the lessons from these developments? Does it mean that nothing really seriously has changed? This is not the case, although we have not gone as far as some of those of us who have been trying to articulate a notion of world order that will include not only the traditional understanding of stability and order, but also a sense of justice and accountability. Two important things. First of all, a certain insecurity about the fate of the perpetrators. It is true that one of the things that this development has added is, if somebody is engaged in this kind of practices, they don't know what will happen to them, especially if they fall from power. They may have the fate of Mobutu Sese Seko, which never paid the price, or Jean-Claude Duvalier, or Idi Amin Dada, but they may have the fate of Charles Taylor. They may have the fate of a Milosevic. They may have a fate of a Mladic. They may have a fate of Hissène Habré. Of course, we have to wait and see, for example, what's going to happen with Omar Bashir in Sudan. But the most important, of course, thing to watch there clearly is the indictment that is hanging over the head of a member of one of the P5, because that's where the ball game is really played. What's going to happen to Putin? To what extent this may have an impact on his future, especially if there is some kind of transition in Russia. But the other thing I think it is kind of encouraging, and I will conclude with this, is that it has mobilized, it has proliferated the different fora on which global justice issues can be pursued. And it has created a transnational activist community that has been very active, very engaged, and has used these fora very skillfully at times in order to at least make sure that the world is not forgetting what is happening in certain places. And in some situations, this transnational community, in association and with the assistance of some major sympathetic powers, mid-level powers, has even managed to curb or curtail the wishes of the most powerful in the international community. The best example here is the adoption of the statute of the International Criminal Court, in which the United States, for example, wanted a prosecutor that will not be able to exercise his or her authority proprio motu. It was the mobilization of the activist community in alliance with member states that were very sympathetic to an independent prosecutor that managed to constrain somehow the wishes of the most powerful players that were sitting around the negotiating table. So they can have an impact in a certain situation, although this impact may not be the desired one. So certain things have changed, which brings me to my last point. When I look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and this is an important lesson to remember, the fundamental document which guides all of us who work in the human rights community, I always find the most fascinating article being Article 28, which says about everything is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in the Declaration can be fully realized. Now, if you read this in conjunction with the preamble to the Declaration that talks about the responsibility that each individual and every organ of society shall strive by teaching, education, and by progressive measures to secure these universal rights. The message that is being delivered here is that this entitlement to an international order is not something that is given to us. It is something that should be earned. This entitlement incurs a certain responsibility on our behalf, each one of us individually and collectively by pooling our resources to try to do everything that we can for these rights to be realized in the international community. So, although genocidal politics will continue, and the message that will be, unfortunately, will be delivered is that power leads, and unfortunately norms follow. Norms do follow, but they follow in a different way than before. They have entered the level of deliberations, the high level of deliberations, of high politics. We may not achieve the desired results that we want, but clearly they have introduced a certain expectations that something is going to happen, or it may happen when these killings occur. The international community knows about it. There is no excuse of ignorance. So the question becomes, what are you going to do about it? This is where the critical question is. And it is the responsibility of those that want to keep the spirit of Article 28 alive to ensure that these platforms are used as effectively as possible to at least make sure, in the words actually of Milan Kundera, who recently passed away, and he was one of my favorite authors, that the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. It is the importance to say that it is the struggle to keep the memory alive, because by keeping the memory alive, we keep venues, options open, whether some of them will be realized or not, remain to be seen. And some of it depends on each one of us and our willingness to be engaged in order to achieve this end. Realizing, of course, that power still matters, and power will always operate on a different logic. But the landscape is changing, and we should use all the openings available to ensure that it proceeds in a direction that at least adds a level of commitment to the notions of the rule of law, human rights, in our understanding of what a world order means. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was really very interesting from a different perspective. It's a very good food for consideration. This is, I understand that this is for a general public audience. This is not for professionals. And I understand that it is very clear. Thank you very much for letting us know what's going on and what stage are we on and what to expect in the future. We will be having any genocides in the future, or finally, human rights will be respected. Thank you. I just want to say, to add here, you see information about Dr. George Andriopoulos, I want to say thank you one more time because actually this event is organized jointly by Ajak İsner NGO Armenia and by just a center, as you see here. Yeah. Center. He is the director of the Center of International Human Rights at John Jay College, and this is some kind of mutual event. Thank you very much for your will to sponsor this program at this event, and the floor is open for questions. If you have any questions, you are welcome. We have only 5 minutes for question answer session. Okay, questions will come. I'm more than sure at the end we will open floor for question answer session as well. Now I want to introduce Dr. Svante Lundgren from Sweden, from Lund University. We will have the information about Professor Lundgren in a minute. And in this part, we are going to speak about, actually, a professor will be introducing Scandinavian humanitarian assistance after the Armenian genocide, a very interesting topic as well, and hopefully we will have questions to discuss this, and it will be interesting. Thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Annie, for inviting me to be part of this this event. Can you see my shared screen now?
Yeah, we can
you
see.
Can. Great, great. Yes. I'm going to talk about the Scandinavian assistance to Armenians, both before, during, and especially after the Armenian genocide. And the background here is the Hamidian massacres in the 1890s, which got a lot of attention both in the US and in Europe. Several prominent figures, politicians, writers, they condemned the Sultan Abdul Hamid for these atrocities and voiced their support for the Armenians. And also several pro-Armenian organizations were established in several countries to help the Armenians. And in Scandinavia, the most important organization giving this assistance was a Christian Protestant organization called Kvinnliga Missionsarbetare, KMA. It means Women Missionary Workers. It was established in Sweden in 1896 and got a branch in Denmark and in Norway a few years later. It was an all-female organization. It sent women, single women, to work in different countries, and it was also run completely by women. I mean, the board of the organizations consisted of women only, and this was at a time when women didn't have the right to vote in political elections. So it was the early feminism in a way. This organization grew to become quite big. They had hundreds of local branches all over the countries. They sent dozens of women to work in different countries. They raised a lot of money. The idea was to mobilize women in Scandinavia to send workers to work among women and children in different countries. And in 1901, KMA also started to work among Armenians, that is Ottoman Armenians, where there were a lot of single women, widows, and orphans after the Hamidian massacres. And during the following decades, KMA sent dozens of, especially nurses, midwives, and some teachers. And those who worked among the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire and were there in 1915, they also became eyewitnesses to the genocide. I'm focusing on 3 of these women, one from each country. Alma Johansson was a nurse and midwife from Sweden. Before and during the genocide, she worked in Mesre and Mush. Bodil Björn was a nurse from Norway. She also worked in Mesre and Mush. And Maria Jacobsen was a nurse from Denmark, and she worked before and during the genocide in Harput. This is a picture taken in 1919 when they all were back home in Scandinavia, and the KMA missionaries who worked among Armenians, they came together in Denmark, and this number 1 sitting is Alma Johansson, number 7 standing is Maria Jacobsen, and number 8 standing is Bodil Björn. They were important eyewitnesses also. Alma Johansson, she wrote a book later, 15 years later, when a very short little pamphlet where she told about what happened to the Armenians of Mush in 1915. Bodil Björn was a very, she was a photographer, and she took a lot of pictures of Armenian life before and during the genocide. And Maria Jacobsen, she kept a diary in Harput, where she wrote, not every day, but very often she wrote about what had happened in the town. This diary was found, she kept it secret, it was found 10 years after her death, and is today one extremely important eyewitness document from the genocide in Harput. It has been published both in Danish original and in English and Armenian translation. After the genocide, most of the KMA missionaries to Armenia, they returned to the region. They wanted to continue to work among those Armenians who had survived. So Alma Johansson, she first spent a few years in Constantinople, where she worked in two Armenian refugee camps. And then she was transferred to Greece, where she worked in Thessaloniki among Armenian refugees there until the Second World War. Bodil Björn also went to Constantinople for a short period. Then she worked a few years in Soviet Armenia, in Alexandropol, that later was renamed Leninakan, and it's today's Gyumri. She headed an orphanage called Yusakpur, but in 1925, she was expelled from the country by the Bolshevik regime. And then she had a last period in Aleppo. And Maria Jacobsen, she returned to Lebanon in 1922 and stayed there for the rest of her life. She died in 1960. She died in Lebanon. She was, for many years, the head of a very famous orphanage called the Bird's Nest, a big orphanage in the town of Byblos or Jipeil. This orphanage was established by the American relief organization Near East Relief, but in 1928, the Danish KMA, they bought the orphanage, and it then was headed by Maria Jacobsen for more than 30 years. 10 years after her death, KMA gave over the work at this orphanage to the Armenian Apostolic Church, the See of Cilicia, and the Bird's Nest is still up and running. It's not an orphanage anymore. It's more like a boarding school where some Armenian children live while they are getting their education. So these women, they worked for a long time, many decades. Nothing could stop them, not even war and genocide. And they worked for an organization with the word mission in its name. So were the missionaries? Yes. They were definitely missionaries. They were deeply religious women. And they had this perseverance that they wanted to return after the trauma of having seen many of their Armenian friends being deported and killed. They still wanted to go back. because they felt that they had a calling, they were called by God to do this work. They worked for the Protestant organization and also in collaboration with local Armenian Protestant churches. And to be honest, in the beginning, they had a quite negative view of the Armenian Apostolic Church. They considered it to be like a church of dead rituals. People would go there, they would not understand what was going on. And the people, they made the rituals, but they didn't have like a real living faith. They didn't have like a real relation to God. That was basically their attitude in the beginning. But then with the genocide, their attitude changed, because now it became important for them also to help the Armenian nation to survive and to strengthen the Armenian identity among those who survived the genocide. And they understood that the Armenian Apostolic Church was an essential part of that identity. So I have sometimes said that they became Armenian nationalists with their experience. And there is a quote, not from one of these three women, but from another Danish aid worker, Karen Jeppe. She once wrote, we went, well, it says here, we went after some children. It means we went to look after, to take care of some children, but found an entire nation then. And I think this is true for all of them. And at the Bird's Nest, for example, it has been estimated that during the time that Maria Jakobsen was the director of that orphanage, 4,000 Armenian orphans or children lived there. And they were, almost all of them were from Armenian apostolic homes, and no one was converted to Protestantism. They were teaching, they were giving Christian education to these children. They had Sunday schools, they had prayer meetings, and so on, but they didn't influence them to become Protestants. They only tried to strengthen their Christian faith and identity. This is the basic main story about what Scandinavians did for the Armenians. That is what these brave women did for decades. But there were also other organizations, and a few words about them. Secular organizations. There was one in Denmark called Danske Armenier Venner, Danish Friends of Armenians. And their most important thing they did was that they sent an aid worker named Karen Jeppe to work among Ottoman Armenians. And she was first in Urfa, and then after the genocide in Aleppo. And in Aleppo, when she returned to Aleppo in the 1920s, she was also a commissioner of the League of Nations, which was the UN of that time. And she was commissioned to try to find Armenians who had been abducted and into Muslim homes, and to release them and bring them back to the Armenian community. We know that this kind of work, many did that kind of work to try to rescue abducted Armenians, and Karen Jeppe was in charge of that work in Aleppo as commissioned by the League of Nations. In Sweden, there was also something called a Svenska Armenien Committee and Swedish Armenia Committee in the 1920s and 30s. And they tried to raise awareness about the Armenian refugee problem by publishing pamphlets and so on. And they also raised money that was sent to Karen Jeppe and to her work in Aleppo. Finally, a few words about what about today? Well, very little is left of this. Danish Friends of Armenians ceased to work in the 1950s. The Swedish Armenia Committee ceased its work in the 1930s. And Women Missionary Workers, KMA, doesn't exist anymore either. The world has changed, and fortunately, there are not as many Armenian orphans today as there were 100 years ago. So things have changed. But still today, there are people in Scandinavia, of course, who are very engaged in what is happening in Armenia, in Artsakh, and to Armenians worldwide. Thank you, Snorkakaloju.
Thank you very much.
I took 14 minutes, so I spared 1 minute for the organizer.
Thank you very much. And you wrote that you were the narrator of the film Map of Salvation. Am I? Yeah, this is a documentary, full-length documentary film about Scandinavian humanitarian assistance to the Armenians after the genocide. And yeah, it's very nice that you had your participation too. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, Vanda, thank you for your very informative presentation. You do mention in the second part of your talk about these organizations, Scandinavians, and the work that they try to do, publicity, canvassing, and so on and so forth. But I want to ask you, was there any similar work done by the missionaries, the 3 missionaries that you mentioned earlier? I mean, you say they work with children, they try to educate them, things like that. Did they try to adopt a higher public profile, for example, writing about their experiences, give lectures, trying to canvass their governments, keep, let's say, the experience, the trauma alive and get their governments to do something, or their work was primarily confined in the Armenian communities?
Right, thank you. That's a great question. And basically, these women, they were very happy with do this grassroots work. They didn't want a position to be well-known, famous characters in society and so on. But they of course, when they were at home in the Scandinavian countries, they would tour the local branches of their organization and give talks and also raise money. And this Maria Jacobsen, she even went to the United States on a fundraising travel in 1920. So yes, they wanted to inform people who were interested about what's going on, and they wanted to raise money. But this lobbying their governments, I have seen nothing of that from this one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. You have a question, Feminijam?
Yes. You spoke about Alma Johansson, Maria Jacobsen, etc. And thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I want to know about Jensine Orts. She had a diary, Tests and Triumphs, issued in 1926. What about Jensine Orts?
Yeah, Jensine Orts is a different story. I could have mentioned something about that also, but because she was originally working as a KMA missionary in I think it was Malatya or some place in Ottoman Armenia, but then she, like all of them, eventually they returned during and or after the war. In her case, to Denmark, and then after the war, as I mentioned, almost all of them wanted to go back. Also, Jensine Orts wanted to go back, but for some reason, KMA didn't want to send her. There was some kind of, I don't know, conflict there. So she didn't get the right to work for KMA. What did she do? She established an organization of her own and went to Greece, to Thessaloniki, to work among Armenian refugees there. She left that work after some years and moved to the United States. But the organization that she established in 1922, it does in fact still exist in Denmark. It's a small NGO called Dansk Armenier Mission, Danish mission to the Armenians, but they still support Armenians in Lebanon and in Armenia. So yes, that was another figure, a little bit on the sideline of this main story of KNA.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's really very, very interesting. Thank you very much. I guess we will have some more questions at the end of when we conclude the event. And now, Teminijan, I think it's the right time to just speak about your very interesting topic. Just very quick introduction. Temine Martoyan holds PhD in history. She is a senior researcher at the Armenian Genocide Museum and Institute. And at the same time, she teaches. She's a lecturer at the Yerevan Klazar University, the chair of international relations. And now Temine will introduce her topic. Thank you very much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear organizers, the Center for International Human Rights and John Jay College and Ajak İzmir NGO. Thank you very much to especially Ani Manukyan. Dear speakers, the continuation of the Young Turks' policy of annihilation of the national minorities was manifested through the Kemalist regime's roof treatment of the Greek and Armenian populations. If we accept the thesis put forward in the genocide studies and in the Turkish denialist historiography that the Christian minorities, particularly the Armenians, have destabilized the Ottoman state and later the Turkish Republic, that they have threatened with their actions fragmentation of the country, therefore causing the continuation of the genocide. Then how could we explain, for instance, the genocidal actions implemented beyond the borders of the Ottoman state? The Kemalists intentionally have subjected the Armenian population of Eastern Armenia to massacres, targeting not only the people, but the state where the people inhabited. How could we explain that fact that on 27 September 2020, Azerbaijan, supported by Turkey, initiated without any grounds a large-scale war against the Republic of Artsakh and the Republic of Armenia? A group of members of the International Association of Genocide Scholars were convinced that Turkey's immediate involvement in the decade-long conflict is no more a mere threat to be considered by the Armenians of Artsakh, Armenia, and Turkey, but an actual fact that threatens the physical presence of Armenians in Artsakh and beyond. On March 17, 2019, in Izmir, during the first joint pre-election rally of justice and development and nationalist movement parties, Erdogan uttered the following words: "Izmir, you carry all the colors and richness of our country in you. Izmir, you having regained your freedom on September 9th through the troops of Qazi Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, you having thrown the infidel into the sea and having taken the homeless into your bosom, Izmir." So on September 3, 2022, within the framework of the Black Sea Technofest 2022 in Samsun, Erdogan noted that the American base located in Alexandroupoli and the S-300s are a threat to them, adding, "Hey, Greece, look at history. Go back through history. If you continue like this, you will pay for it heavily. We have one sentence to say to Greece: don't forget Izmir. The time will come and we will do what is necessary. As we say, we can come suddenly in the night." A century has passed since September 1922, the annihilation of peaceful and unarmed Christian population of Smyrna, the arson and destruction of their neighborhoods, numerous innocent victims of the brutal policies of Kemalists who came to power in Turkey were elderly, women, and children. The tragedy of Smyrna deeply affected the contemporaries, and to this day it continues to draw the attention of many scholars, which is important in terms of researching the history of the Armenian and Greek genocides. In a scientific lecture dedicated to the topic, we often find the terms, for example, disaster, fire, massacre, annihilation, and other expressions. It's views that great catastrophe is referred to, which being an action indicated the end of the Kemalist regime's genocidal policy, should have a special definition. The calamity of Smyrna remained unpunished. The big powers did not condemn it as a grave crime committed against humanity. Therefore, the tragedy was followed by genocides of many other peoples in the world. This is why it's important to always keep the remembrance of such tragedies fresh in the memory of mankind, so that these explosions that can destroy peoples, desolate the world, and destroy civilizations are not repeated. The impunity toward the genocidal policies of a state creates conditions for the planning and execution of a new and even more sophisticated international crime. Moreover, defining deliberate international crime with mitigating terms shows down or even halts the progress that progressive humanity is striving for. The state of human security continues to be in question today, as long as the possibility of living in peace is not fully sacred for humans. Also, the establishment of a safe and peaceful world is conditionally by the identification and imposition of punishment for such crimes that have parallelly taken place during the genocides and are equivalent to them. Thousands of eyewitnesses have left us a great legacy in the form of testimonies, memoirs, and research. The works, for example, for George Orton, Henry Morgan Shaw, Edward Hale Bierstadt, René Pio, and others, as well as the yet unpublished memoirs and newly discovered archival documents, are not for mere reading. They all have one general message: their desperate efforts to stop the massacres happening and escalating in Smyrna have forced them to write truthful accounts about the mass extermination of the people. They wrote down the descriptions of those horrific events, believing that one day their testimonies would serve as documents to accurately describe what had happened and punish the guilty. Smyrna was the largest city of the Ottoman Empire after Constantinople. It was an important center of diplomatic activity by the European states. Smyrna, with its multi-ethnic and multicultural existence, greatly contributed to the progress of the Armenians and Greeks, but also to the other nations living there. The population of Smyrna was distributed in separate quarters according to nationality: Greeks, Armenians, Jewish, Turkish, etc. The Turkish cavalry entered Smyrna on September 9. Mass killings, looting, and violence began and continued for several days. According to Edward Hale Bierstadt, Executive Secretary for Refugees in the Middle East, what happened was a massacre, accompanied by every manifestation of cruelty. Dr. Lysimachos Oikonomos described how Turkish army irregulars that invaded the Armenian quarter slaughtered the population with knives and bayonets. It was recorded in the press that nothing was lacking in Smyrna: neither massacre, nor rape, nor fire, nor looting. Killings continued in the city for 3 days and nights. Wagons loaded with corpses were driven to distant places and were also used to transport looted goods. A large number of Greeks were declared, and among them was the wealthy merchant Socrates Onassis, the father of the future world-famous entrepreneur Aristotle Onassis. The Turks hanged Socrates' brother Alexander and burned his sister with family members and 5 fellow villagers alive. Scenes of murder accompanied by extreme fanaticism were to be seen everywhere. George Horton, the US consul in Smyrna, characterized the annihilation of Greeks and Armenians as a Dantean tragedy and noted the rarity of similar cases in world history. The atrocity of the ritualized murder of the Greek Metropolitan Chrysostomos Kalafadis of Smyrna stands out for its brutality, which witnesses remember with great pain and horror. Chrysostomos was tortured using an extremely crude religious ritual. They first beat him with fists and canes, then spat in his face, stabbed him with knives, tore off his beard, gouged his eyes out, and cut off his nose and ears. His quartered body was dragged to the Turkish quarter. Horton wrote, Chrysostomos' only sin was that this patriotic and eloquent Greek believed in his prosperity of his people. Chrysostomos, shortly before his death, came to the consulate together with the Armenian archbishop. He was wearing black robes and his face was very pale. The shadow of impending death could be seen on his features. Neither he nor the Armenian bishop spoke to me of their own danger, but instead asked if nothing could be done to spare the people of Smyrna. Reports about the burning of Smyrna are varied and diverse. The testimonies of eyewitnesses are very valuable, according to which the streets leading to the Greek and Armenian quarter were guarded by Turkish soldiers. Armed Turks included soldiers massacred the inhabitants, looted their property, and destroyed their houses. That was followed by arson. The Turks poured oil or other inflammable substances on the houses from tin cans and threw rags soaked in oil from the windows. Mustafa Kemal, referring to the firing of Smyrna, appealed to his compatriots, saying, taking a long look at this scene, this is the end of foreign interference in our country. This fire is a symbol of that. It means that our homeland has finally been liberated from traders and traders. From now on, liberated and purified Turkey will belong only to the Turks. The massacres in Smyrna were accompanied by looting and extensive destruction of both Greek and Armenian cultural property. Dozens of educational, cultural, and spiritual institutions were turned into ashes. The premeditated Kemalists' plan to set fire to the Christian neighborhoods was aimed at hiding traces of the crimes committed and at the same time eliminating the Christian population's rich culture. The work of rescuing the tens of thousands surviving Greeks and Armenians in Smyrna achieved considerable success. According to the information reported by the American New York Times newspaper on September 18, 1922, there were on September 14, 6 steamships in the Smyrna coastal area, 1 American, 1 Japanese, 2 French, and 2 Italian. According to the Athens Telegraph special correspondence report on September 15, contemporaries were aware of the extent of the terrible tragedy, especially when the American ship Unona transported about 1,800 Greeks and Armenians to the Greek port of Piraeus. The Japanese ship Tokei Maru arrived in Smyrna on September 14. Kemal's naval forces surrounding the ship threatened to sink it. The Japanese commander said that touching even a hair on the migrant's head would be seen as an insult to the Japanese flag and a threat to Japan, and that he would immediately demand an apology from the Kemalist government. The Kemalists reported the situation to their superiors and pledged not to disturb the ship. Ignoring the Turks' threats, the Japanese captain managed to save more than 800 lives, landing them safely at the Greek port of Piraeus. Greece became a hospitable refugee with wide open doors for many Armenians. Tens of thousands of panic-stricken refugees reaching Piraeus went to Athens, Thessaloniki, and the region's refugee camps. The settlement of Armenians and Greeks in Greece, although difficult, was being realized. The local Greeks welcomed them with open arms as full family members. They received all citizenship rights without any discrimination. Local schools, churches, theaters, army barracks, and warehouses were provided as temporary accommodation for refugees who had arrived in Thessaloniki. Cultural centers, temples, and military units in Athens also became places of residence of those people. Armenian working migrants standing next to the Greek workers became a factor in the development of Greek industry in the fields of carpet making, weaving, silk manufacture, and other traders. So genocide is not an event, but an unfolding process. According to Raphael Lemkin, genocide encompasses the physical annihilation of a group through the direct perpetration of harm or indirect action that contributes to this goal. Furthering this assertion, Lemkin also argued that genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a national group, but is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundation of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. Article 2 of the Genocide Convention also defines genocidal acts as not only those causing the immediate physical destruction of a group, but also the acts which create conditions leading to physical destruction, including the infliction of mental harm. One method of committing genocide in an indirect, non-immediate manner is what is defined as genocide by attrition. Genocide by attrition occurs when a group is stripped of its human, political, civil, and economic rights over an extended period. Over time, this leads to the deprivation of conditions necessary to sustain life among victims of these policies, generating a deliberately inflicted crisis of survival that leads to the erasure and extermination of the targeted people. Genocide is continuing. In the 21st century, it is indisputable that the right of life and the right to fund and adequate medical care are inseparable. A wanton denial of adequate food, energy, and medicine enacted with the intent to discriminate against a targeted group is a genocide by attrition that intends to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So from 12 December 2022 to the present day, the only road connected Artsakh with Armenia and the outside world has been blocked by Azerbaijan. This blockade has distributed and nearly sought access to essential goods and services, including food, fuel, and medication among the population of Artsakh. This inhuman policy highlights the practice of effectively carrying out genocide by attrition against the 120,000 Armenians living in Artsakh, reflecting on policies inflicted by the Nazis against Jews living in ghettos across Europe during World War II, resulted in the deaths of over 700,000 Jews along through hunger and illness from poor sanitary conditions and a lack of medical care. Genocide by attrition is a vivid example that genocide is a process, and identification of the above-mentioned policies and actions is crucial for detecting early warning signs of genocide in progress and preventing them from coming to pass. As the mere title of Genocide Convention implies, the convention has dual goals: prevention and punishment. All those 152 states who have signed the Genocide Convention are under legal obligation to identify and prevent a genocide that is currently unfolding in Artsakh. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Temine. I want to open the floor for questions. If you have any questions to our speaker number 3, you are welcome. Any follow-up remark? Any questions?
Ani, I don't know if you can see, but Vasily has his hand up.
Yeah. I see his microphone is muted.
It's open
yeah,
now.
it's open now.
Good
yeah.
evening to all of you. I've got a question for Mrs. Martoyan. According to the eyewitnesses, who committed the crimes in Izmir? The soldiers or also ordinary people, local Turks? And what was the attitude of the others in Izmir, in Smyrna, like the Jews or the Levantines during the time of these atrocities against the Armenians and the Greeks? Thank you.
Thank you very much for interesting questions. Yes, the Turkish cavalry entered Smyrna on September 9, and we know that mass killings, looting, and violence began and continued for several days. And besides cavalry, the Turkish people, as we know, there was a Turkish district in Smyrna, and a small district, because we know about Greeks, Armenians, Jews, European districts, etc. So the people also was included in this massacre. And as we spoke about bystanders, we can call them bystanders. We know that Jews they just try to help the Turks, because we have a lot of memoirs and we read about the acceptance, about the actions of Jews who know the Armenians who were living in, for example, Jewish district. They show their homes and they help the Turks. But after killings, looting, and afterwards they're evacuating to other countries, we know that Jews were in the same situation. And after that, when they were speaking with the slaves who stayed in Smyrna till 1923, they began to ask them for help. But unfortunately, we know that this was organized by the Kemalists and also not only the troops, but also civilian groups were participating in the massacre, especially in looting, in killings, and the whole violence. Thank you very much.
I see we have another question from Dr. George Andreapoulos.
Yeah, not a question, a couple of comments, but first let me start by saying, Mariam, I appreciated your presentation and brought back memories, because I grew up in a section of Athens called Nea Smyrni, which is the area where those that managed to survive the 1922 massacres relocated to. And in fact, there is also an entity there called Estia Nea Smyrnis, which is a tremendous resource of documents and testimonials about the massacres, and it's an interesting resource to have in mind. The comment that I have, actually a couple of comments, is, first of all, I see personally some eerie parallels between how the Western powers embraced Kemal Atatürk after the massacres, because they needed him for geostrategic regions, and how the Western allies, especially the United States, is now embracing Erdogan, despite the fact of the atrocities that are being committed against Kurds, among others, but also opposition groups in Turkey. Of course, these don't reach the level of genocide, but Erdogan can make crimes against humanity because they need him for the alliance. First of all, to make sure that they get the okay for Sweden to join NATO, but also to probably bring him on his side, on their side, in an effort to contain Russia. So they are not exactly the same, but it's kind of interesting parallels how, those who are engaged are embraced, which goes back to the earlier point that power still leads the way in many ways, and norms follow, the consideration of norms. The other comment I have to say is that from personal experience, having participated in many conferences in genocide in this country, but also in other countries, one of the things that I have been impressed within quotation marks and has made so difficult for the administration to openly come and talk about these things as genocide. I'm leaving aside Senate resolutions and the debate. I'm talking about officials in the White House and government officials, is the fact that in addition to the geostrategic reasons that we refer, the Turkish lobby is extremely well organized and mobilizes whenever there is any activity that will try to expose that part of their history. The Institute of Turkish Studies, for example, in Washington, has been extremely instrumental. Anytime there is any kind of event relating to the Armenian genocide or other, they will send a team present. They will enlist academics. They will write letters. They will call congressmen. They will call senators. They will call the White House. I know that from experience in one of the conferences I organized many years ago about genocide that we discussed about the Armenian genocide. And the calls that I myself received from people that were assistants of congressmen or senators, that they were asking me about calls they were receiving from the Institute of Turkish Studies about the conference that I was organizing in the university. So you have to give them credit in one is they are amazingly well organized, and that is adds another level of difficulty in getting more open discussion, more acceptance at the highest echelons of administration officials about the horrors that were committed in that period.
Thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, for reminding about Estiane Asmirni. I have been there, it's amazing. And I remember Ayafotini in Asmirni district. And also I have been in Mikrasati Konspuzon.
Okay.
And yes, and last year in Armenia, we have international conference at the anniversary of 100 of the annihilation of Greeks and Armenians. And in Armenia district Nubarashen, we opened a new street named Neazmirni, in Armenian Nor Smyrnia. So as I have some conferences, and recently I have been in Athens, at the Athens University, and there was a very well-organized conference, and there were participants from Turkey, approximately 8 participants from Turkey, and it was devoted to Smyrna, and it looks like that they follow the conference, and it was a great speech, maybe Hamid Bozarslan, and he spoke about Kemalists, he spoke about Turkish state, etc. And as we know about Erdogan, and from 2019 till today, he is continually following everything, conferences, meetings, etc. And every time he likes to say, you having thrown the unfidel into the sea and having taken the homeless into your bosom, Izmir. And every time when they began to speak about this tragedy, he also liked to say, as we say, we can come suddenly in the night. So thank you very much for your comments.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I want to say big thank you to all the participants, to our wonderful speakers, to people who are interested, for your time, for being with us, for sharing your notes, your knowledge with us. And I want to ask Dr. Petrosyan, are you here? Dr. Petrosyan, I want to say big thank you to Dr. Petrosyan because she has been helping me a lot. Thanks to her help, I know Dr. George Andreopoulos, and I'm very, very glad that today in July, which is this break time, yeah, people want to have vacation, you are here, you're just sparing your time here. It means that it is interesting for you and you value your time here. Guardian, thank you very much. You have been doing a lot, and you remember that you have your big contribution to a topic which has to be here because you see that we are fighting for justice. Do you have anything to say as a concluding note at the end of the event or not?
Well, I just want to thank the speakers for their time. As you said, this is a time where usually most conferences don't happen, and just finding this time for this event is greatly appreciated. And I thank each and every one of you for your contributions, for the food that you have provided today for thought. I've taken a lot of notes actually, and I have many questions, but I don't think we have the time for them. So I'll probably end up individually following up with each one of you with my questions. But I just want to, I know there's Hasmik has her hand up, and I don't know.
She has a question, yeah.
For a question before we end the conference, but I just want to make sure she doesn't feel ignored. Just thank you to all of you for your contribution and for making the time for this. This means a lot to us.
Thank you very much. Hasmikjan, you have a question?
Yes, thank you so much. I have a question to Tehmine. Thank you, Tehmine, for your very interesting and I think very important presentation for these days for Armenians regarding to the issue of Artsakh. You put your talk actually in the context of continuation of genocide in the Ottoman Empire against Armenians, and then Armenians, Greeks, actually we call it also Ottoman genocide, and then continuing it in Republic of Turkey and now in Artsakh. I'm not an expert in law, in a sphere of law and genocide, but I would like to know your opinion about how we should divide the responsibility when we put in this continuation different republics in sense of Republic of Turkey and now Azerbaijan, and we consider all these genocides in one process. I hope that I explained my question pretty well. Thank you so much.
Dear Hasmik, thank you very much for your question. Yes, I spoke about the annihilation of the Armenians and Greeks of Smyrna and the arson of their neighborhoods as a continuation of genocidal policy, and I spoke not only about the Smyrna and also nowadays in all over the world and especially in Artsakh. And we know that at this moment, this inhuman policy highlights the practice of effectively carrying out genocide by attrition against the Armenians living in Artsakh. So it's very complicated period, and I'm very grateful to Ani Manukyan, Gohar Petrosyan, Mr. George Andreopoulos, and Svante and the whole professors and organizers who had the opportunity to speak about once more about the genocidal policy at this moment. And I hope that these discussions can help us and just to think about our acts, and I hope that everything will be fine for the Armenians living in Artsakh now. And today I had some information about Greek Ethnos magazine, and I, for the first time, read about the response of Greece on Armenians living in Artsakh, and in that report noted that let's not to let Stepanakert to be repeated like Srebrenica in after 28 years before, which had happened in Bosnia. So they compared the situation in Stepanakert with Srebrenica, and I noticed that they also want to promote this process, and I hope that, and also they said that European people and the whole humanitarian activities should act, and we expect for action. We expect the actions of humanists and the European country, the USA, and the whole people who don't want to let continue the genocide. We should stop this continuation, and it's very complicated. It's very difficult just to do something, but we should think about that. Let's to stop. Let's not to help the people of Azerbaijan and Turkey. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hopefully we will have good recording of this mini discussion, mini conference. Dr. Petrosyan will share with me, and I will share this recording with you, and I will post it with your permission on social media. I mean, mainly on Facebook, if you don't mind, with your permission, of course. And hopefully more people who didn't manage to do it today, they will have a chance to listen to your speeches, and they will, just like they will have very good food for consideration. Thank you very much again for your time, for being with us. Have a very peaceful day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.